Ethan Carter sat behind the wheel of his patrol car, the hum of the radio filling the quiet night. Willow Creek was a small town, the kind of place where everyone knew each other's name. After 20 years on the force, Ethan had learned that most trouble in Willow Creek was minor a bar fight, a stolen bicycle, or the occasional teenager sneaking beer into the park. But the call he received that night was different. All units, report to 1456 Willow Street. Possible abandonment case. Multiple minors involved. Ethan's jaw tightened as he flipped on the siren and sped toward the address. Willow Street wasn't exactly the best part of town. It was lined with worn-down houses and peeling paint, the kind of place where people struggled to make ends meet. As Ethan pulled up to the house, the hairs on the back of his neck stood up. The porch light flickered. The windows were dark. He stepped out of the car, the cool night air biting at his skin. From inside the house, he could hear it faint crying. High-pitched and desperate. His hand instinctively moved toward his gun as he approached the door. Police. Is anyone inside? No answer, just the sound of sobbing. Ethan pushed the door open, and his breath caught in his throat. 6 children. Huddled together in the corner of the dimly lit room were 6 little girls, the oldest looking about 12, the youngest no older than 4. They clung to each other, their wide eyes brimming with fear. The room was practically empty, a worn-out couch pushed against the wall, a broken coffee table littered with empty cans and torn papers. The oldest girl, dark braids falling across her shoulders, stood protectively in front of the others. Her chin lifted in quiet defiance despite the fear in her eyes. "It's okay," Ethan said, lowering his voice as he crouched down. "I'm here to help." The girl didn't move. Her gaze was sharp, guarded. "Who are you?" Ethan asked softly. "Amaya," she said, her voice steady. "And these are my sisters. Lena, Sierra, Tiana, Ava, and Jasmine." "Where are your parents?" Amaya's face darkened. "They're not coming back." Ethan's heart twisted painfully. "Do you have any other family we can call?" Amaya shook her head. "Then where have you been staying?" "Here," Amaya whispered. "We were waiting for them to come back." Ethan took a deep breath. He knew how the system worked. If there was no next of kin, these girls would be separated, scattered into different foster homes. And 6 girls. They'd never be kept together. "We can't stay here," Ethan said. "I'm going to take you somewhere safe." Amaya's eyes narrowed. "Together. Together." Amaya studied him for a long moment before giving him a reluctant nod. Slowly, the other girls began to emerge from behind her, their small hands clutching each other's shirts. "Come on," Ethan said softly, holding out his hand. "Let's get you home." As he led them outside to the car, Jasmine, the youngest, slipped her hand into his. Ethan's heart swelled painfully as he helped them into the back seat. As he drove them toward the station, Amaya's voice cut through the quiet. "Are you going to send us away?" "No," Ethan said. He tightened his grip on the steering wheel. "I'll figure something out." And as he glanced into the rearview mirror, seeing 6 sets of frightened eyes watching him, something shifted in his chest. He didn't know why, but he was already certain. He wasn't letting them go. Ethan's house had been quiet for years. After his wife passed away, the silence became a strange comfort, a familiar loneliness. But now it was chaos. Lena and Sierra were arguing over a spot on the couch. Ava was sitting on the floor playing with a stuffed animal, while Jasmine followed Ethan around the house like a shadow. Amaya stood near the window, arms crossed, eyes distant. Ethan rubbed the back of his neck, standing in the center of the room. He'd been a cop for 20 years, faced down armed criminals and saved lives, but this was uncharted territory. "All right," Ethan said, trying to sound confident. "Let's get some dinner." He opened the fridge and immediately realized two things. He had no idea what 6 little girls would eat. He hadn't gone grocery shopping in a week. "Mac and cheese," he offered weakly. Amaya's sharp gaze slid toward him. "Is that all you have?" Ethan sighed. "It's what I've got." Sierra scrunched her nose. "I don't like cheese." "Well, what do you want?" "Rice and chicken," Amaya said. Ethan frowned. "I don't know how to make that. Mom used to make it with onions and peppers." Ethan hesitated. Then he nodded. "All right. Let's give it a shot." An hour later, the kitchen was a disaster. There was rice stuck to the stove, and Ethan was pretty sure he'd overcooked the chicken. He sat the plates down in front of the girls, prepared for them to hate it. Amaya took a bite. Her gaze met his across the table. "It's not terrible." Ethan smiled. Sierra grinned. "It's actually kind of good." Ava and Lena nodded in agreement. "You know," Ethan said, leaning back, "I might get the hang of this." That night, as Ethan was turning off the lights, Amaya's voice stopped him. "Ethan." "Yeah. Thanks." Ethan's heart squeezed. "For what?" "For trying." He smiled into the dark. "Anytime, kid." And for the first time since his wife passed, Ethan Carter fell asleep, not to the sound of silence but to the soft, steady breathing of his new family. Monday morning arrived with a sharp chill in the air. Ethan stood in the driveway, watching the girls pile into the car. Amaya sat in the front seat, her arms crossed over her chest, while Sierra, Tiana, Lena, Ava, and Jasmine squeezed into the back. The chatter and occasional bickering among them filled the car with a chaotic warmth that Ethan was slowly getting used to. "All right, first day," Ethan said as he adjusted the rearview mirror. "Everybody ready?" No one answered. Ethan sighed. "Okay, then. Let's go." The drive to Willow Creek Elementary was quiet. Amaya stared out the window, her face set in stone. Tiana sat with her arms wrapped tightly around herself, jaw clenched. Sierra was nervously fidgeting with the hem of her jacket. As Ethan pulled up to the school, the reality of the situation hit him hard. Willow Creek was a predominantly white town. There were very few black families, and none of them were as large or as visible as Ethan's new household. Amaya's gaze darkened as the other students started staring the moment they stepped out of the car. Some whispered behind cupped hands. Others openly gawked. Ethan crouched down next to Amaya, putting a hand on her shoulder. "Hey. It's going to be okay." Amaya's expression didn't soften. "You don't know that." "You're right," Ethan said. "But you've got each other. And you've got me." Amaya's eyes softened, but the hardness didn't disappear completely. She gave him a small nod before leading the others toward the front door. Ethan watched them go, his heart heavy. But things unraveled faster than he expected. Later that afternoon. "You need to come down to the school immediately." Ethan's heart dropped at the sound of the principal's sharp tone over the phone. He grabbed his jacket and drove straight to the school. When he walked into the principal's office, he found Tiana sitting in a chair, her arms crossed and her expression set in defiance. Across from her was Coach Miller, his face twisted in anger. "Mr. Carter," the principal began. "We have a situation." Ethan's eyes narrowed. What happened? Tiana was involved in a fight during gym class. Ethan's gaze slid toward Tiana. She sat stiffly in her chair, her eyes dark and cold. Is that true? Ethan asked. Tiana's jaw tightened. I didn't start it. She was disrespecting the other students, Coach Miller interrupted. Aggressive. And when one of the boys called her a name, she hit him. What name? Ethan's voice sharpened. Coach Miller hesitated. It's not important. It's important to me. Tiana's face darkened. Her lips pressed into a hard line. He called me the N-word. The room went cold. Ethan's eyes flashed toward Coach Miller, whose expression immediately turned defensive. We have a zero-tolerance policy for violence, the principal said carefully. We're suspending her for 3 days. Ethan's voice was low and dangerous. You're suspending her for defending herself against a racial slur. Rules are rules, Coach Miller said dismissively. But I guess it's okay for one of your students to call her that. We're addressing that separately. Separately. Ethan scoffed. So Tiana gets suspended while the kid who insulted her gets a slap on the wrist. It's complicated, the principal said, clearly uncomfortable. No, Ethan growled. It's not. Ethan crouched down beside Tiana, meeting her eyes. What happened? He said I didn't belong here, Tiana whispered, her voice trembling with barely contained anger. That I should go back to where I came from. And I told him to shut up, but he wouldn't stop. So I hit him. Ethan swallowed the wave of rage rising inside him. He took a deep breath and gently took Tiana's hand. You're not in trouble with me, Ethan said softly. And you do belong here. Tiana's eyes filled with tears, but she quickly blinked them away. Mr. Carter, you need to control your daughter's behavior, Coach Miller said. Ethan stood slowly, his expression dangerously calm. Let me be clear, Ethan said, his voice low. Tiana isn't the one who needs to learn how to behave. If you think I'm going to let you punish her for standing up for herself, you're out of your damn mind. Coach Miller's face darkened. Mr. Carter. This conversation is over, Ethan cut him off. He took Tiana's hand and led her toward the door. Ethan, the principal started. File whatever complaint you want, Ethan snapped. But if you think I'm going to let you treat my daughter this way, you don't know me very well. Tiana's head whipped toward him. Your daughter? Ethan stopped walking. His chest tightened. He hadn't meant to say it, but it had slipped out naturally, without hesitation. Tiana's lips parted slightly, her expression unreadable. Come on, Ethan said, his voice soft. Let's go home. That night, Tiana sat at the edge of the couch, her hands wrapped around a mug of hot chocolate. Did you mean it? She asked quietly. Mean what? Ethan sat down next to her. When you called me your daughter. Ethan's throat tightened. He hesitated, then said, yes. Tiana's eyes shone with something that might have been tears. She looked down at her mug, her expression unreadable. No one's ever stood up for me like that, she said. Get used to it, Ethan said softly. Because I'm not going anywhere. Slowly, Tiana's hand slipped into his. Thanks. Dad. Ethan froze. Tiana's gaze stayed on the floor, but the word was clear and deliberate. His heart twisted painfully in his chest as he squeezed her hand. Anytime, sweetheart. Ethan sat there long after Tiana had gone to bed, his heart still racing. He'd walked into that school as a single man trying to do the right thing. He left knowing, for the first time, that he wasn't just a man taking care of 6 girls. He was their father. Ethan's house had always been quiet. Too quiet. But not anymore. Now, it was filled with the sounds of footsteps racing down the hall, the buzz of overlapping conversations, the occasional slam of a bedroom door, and the constant murmur of life. But lately, the noise had changed. It was sharper. Tense. Fractured. Ethan stood at the kitchen sink, washing dishes while listening to the sounds of another argument unfolding down the hall. Amaya's voice, sharp and cutting. Tiana's voice, loud and angry. You think you know everything. At least I'm not acting like a victim. I'm not a victim. Then stop acting like one. Ethan sighed and set down the dish. This was the 3rd fight this week. Amaya and Tiana had always been the most independent, the most guarded. But since the school incident, things had been spiraling. Girls. Ethan called. No response. The shouting continued. Hey. Ethan's voice sharpened as he walked toward the hallway. He found them in the living room, standing inches apart. Amaya's fists were clenched at her sides, her eyes blazing. Tiana's jaw was set in angry defiance. Enough. Ethan's voice was sharp and commanding. What the hell is going on? Tiana's face was flushed with anger. She thinks I should have just let that kid say whatever he wanted to me. I didn't say that, Amaya shot back. But maybe punching someone isn't the solution to every problem. And what should I have done, huh? Tiana's eyes narrowed. Let him walk all over me. I'm saying you need to be smart about it. Oh, I get it, Tiana's lips curled bitterly. You want me to be quiet? You want me to just sit there and take it like you do? Amaya's eyes flashed dangerously. You don't know what the hell you're talking about. I know exactly what I'm talking about. Tiana yelled. I'm not weak. Amaya's face twisted. Neither am I. That's enough. Ethan's voice boomed through the room, cutting through the tension like a knife. Both girls flinched and turned toward him. I don't care who started it, Ethan said, his voice dangerously low. I don't care who's right or wrong. What I care about is that you're sisters. And you will not stand here and tear each other apart in my house. Tiana's chest heaved. Amaya's fist slowly unclenched. Tiana, Ethan said, softening his tone, go cool off. Now. Tiana's gaze lingered on Amaya for a long, tense second. Then, with a sharp shake of her head, she stormed down the hall and slammed her bedroom door. Ethan ran a hand down his face. His heart was still pounding. What the hell is going on with you two? He asked Amaya. Amaya's gaze darkened. She's reckless. She acts without thinking. And you don't. Amaya's lips tightened. I don't make trouble. I survive. Surviving isn't the same as living, Ethan said. And sometimes, fighting back is the only way to survive. Amaya's gaze softened but only slightly. She's going to get herself hurt. And you think you can protect her by pushing her away? Amaya's jaw tightened. Someone has to be strong. Ethan's chest ached at the weight of her words. He knew where it came from. Amaya had taken on the role of protector since the day they lost their parents. She was the shield, the quiet strength behind her sisters. Amaya, it's not your job to carry everything. Amaya's gaze sharpened. If I don't, who will? Ethan reached out, resting his hand on her shoulder. I will, he said softly. You don't have to do this alone anymore. Amaya's eyes shone with unshed tears, but she shook her head and pulled away. I'm fine, she said, her voice stiff. We don't need you to save us. Ethan's heart twisted. Maybe not. But you need someone to have your back. Amaya's expression flickered. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then Amaya turned toward the stairs. I'll talk to her, Ethan said. Amaya hesitated. Good luck. Later that night, Ethan knocked gently on Tiana's bedroom door. No answer. He opened it slowly and found her curled up on the bed, arms wrapped around her knees. Can I come in? Tiana shrugged. Ethan sat down at the edge of the bed. Wanna tell me what that was about? Tiana didn't answer. Ethan sighed. Tiana, I'm not mad. I need to understand. Tiana's jaw tightened. She thinks I'm reckless. She's scared. Tiana's head snapped toward him. Of what? Of losing you. Tiana's mouth parted slightly. Amaya has been holding everything together since the day you lost your parents, Ethan said quietly. But now she's not alone anymore. And that scares her. Tiana swallowed hard. She thinks I'm weak. No, Ethan said firmly. She thinks you're strong. But you're not invincible. Tiana's expression softened. Her lips trembled. I hate how they look at me. I know. And it's not going to stop, is it? Ethan's chest tightened painfully. No. It's not. Tiana's eyes filled with tears. Then what am I supposed to do? Ethan's hand slid over hers. You face it? How? With your sisters. And with me. A tear slipped down Tiana's cheek. I don't know if I can. You can. How do you know? Ethan smiled faintly. Because you already have. Tiana's gaze searched his face. Slowly, she leaned forward and rested her head against his shoulder. Ethan's arms wrapped around her, holding her tightly. I've got you, he whispered. I've always got you. Tiana's breath hitched. Promise, she whispered. Promise. Ethan sat there for a long time, holding his daughter as she cried. He knew this wasn't over. The road ahead would be long, and the battles would keep coming. But they would face them together. Ethan's hands were shaking. He stood outside the principal's office, his fists clenching and unclenching at his sides. Through the glass window, he could see Tiana sitting across from the principal, her head bowed and her shoulders hunched forward. It was happening again. He inhaled deeply, trying to steady his racing heart. Stay calm, he whispered to himself. Stay calm for her. The door swung open, and the principal, Mrs. Carter, stepped out. A thin woman with sharp eyes and a severe expression, she looked at Ethan with the kind of tired annoyance that made his blood boil. Mr. Carter, please come in. Ethan stepped into the office. Tiana didn't look up. Sit, Mrs. Carter said briskly, gesturing toward the chair next to Tiana. Ethan sat down, resting his hand lightly on Tiana's back. What happened? He asked, his tone low and controlled. Mrs. Carter sat down behind her desk, folding her hands in front of her. Tiana was involved in another altercation. Ethan's jaw tightened. What kind of altercation? Mrs. Carter's eyes narrowed. She punched another student. Ethan's gaze slid toward Tiana. She was looking at the floor, her lips pressed together. Why? Ethan asked carefully. Because he wouldn't stop calling me names, Tiana said, her voice quiet but sharp. Ethan's heart twisted painfully. What names? Tiana's hands curled into fists. The same ones as before. Mrs. Carter sighed. Mr. Carter, I understand your concern, but we cannot tolerate physical violence in this school. And what about the kid who insulted her? We'll be handling that separately. Handling it? Ethan's voice sharpened. You mean another slap on the wrist? Mrs. Carter's gaze hardened. I'm sorry, but the rules are clear. Tiana will be suspended for 5 days. Tiana's head shot up. What? You've got to be kidding me, Ethan said coldly. I'm not, Mrs. Carter said flatly. We have a zero-tolerance policy for violence. And for racism? Ethan asked. Mrs. Carter's mouth pressed into a thin line. We're working on improving that. Ethan's jaw tightened. That's not good enough. I'm sorry you feel that way, Mrs. Carter said stiffly. Ethan stood, his eyes flashing with anger. Come on, Tiana. Tiana hesitated. Am I really suspended? Yes, Mrs. Carter said. Ethan's hand settled protectively on Tiana's back. We're leaving. Mr. Carter, this will go on her record. And I'll make sure it comes off, Ethan said icily. Mrs. Carter's gaze sharpened. Threatening the school board won't help you. It's not a threat, Ethan said darkly. It's a promise. Tiana followed Ethan out of the office without another word. In the car, they sat in silence for a long time. Tiana stared out the window, her jaw tight and her arms crossed over her chest. Ethan gripped the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. I'm proud of you, he said finally. Tiana's gaze slid toward him. Why? I got suspended. You stood up for yourself. And now I'm in trouble. That's not your fault. Tiana's hands curled into fists. Then why does it feel like it is? Ethan's chest tightened painfully. He pulled the car over to the side of the road and turned toward her. Because that's what this world wants you to believe, he said softly. That you're the problem. That you're too loud or too angry or too different. Tiana's eyes filled with tears. But they're wrong, Ethan said. You hear me? They are wrong. Tiana swallowed hard. It's not fair, she whispered. I know, Ethan said, his voice thick with emotion. But you're not alone anymore. Slowly, Tiana reached for his hand. Ethan squeezed her fingers tightly. I'm tired of fighting, she said softly. Then let me fight for you. Tiana's lower lip trembled. Okay, she whispered. That night, Amaya was waiting for them when they got home. What happened? She asked immediately. Tiana rolled her eyes. Suspended. Amaya's eyes narrowed. Why? Because some kid called me a name and I punched him. Amaya sighed. Tiana. Don't start, Tiana snapped. I'm not apologizing for defending myself. You shouldn't have had to. Tiana's head whipped toward her. What? Amaya's gaze hardened. That's the problem. You shouldn't have had to defend yourself in the first place. Tiana's eyes widened. What they did was wrong, Amaya said. And so is punishing you for it? Tiana blinked rapidly. You think I was right? Amaya hesitated. I think you shouldn't have had to fight in the first place. Tiana's face twisted. Well, I did. And I'm sorry for that, Amaya said quietly. Tiana's eyes softened. Slowly, Amaya extended her hand. After a long pause, Tiana took it. Ethan watched them from across the room, his heart lifting slightly. Small steps. All right, he said, standing. Family meeting. Living room. Now. The girls groaned but gathered on the couch anyway. Ethan stood before them, his arms crossed. We're going to figure this out together, he said. Because what happened today isn't just about Tiana. It's not. Sierra asked. No. Ethan's gaze darkened. This is about all of you. About how this town sees you. About how people treat you. Amaya's jaw tightened. And how are you going to fix that? We're not going to fix it, Ethan said simply. But we're not going to let it break us either. Tiana's gaze sharpened. What are you saying? I'm saying that if this town wants to see us as outsiders, let them. Amaya's eyes narrowed. And we'll show them why they're wrong. Tiana smiled faintly. How? Ethan's expression darkened with quiet determination. We fight back. By hitting people? Lena asked. No, Ethan said. By being better than them. By succeeding in spite of them. And when they push you down. We stand back up, Amaya said quietly. Ethan nodded. Together. A quiet strength filled the room. Amaya leaned back into the couch, a small smile pulling at her lips. So, what's the plan? Ethan's smile was dark and sharp. First, he said. We're getting that suspension overturned. Tiana's lips curled into a smile. And after that? Ethan's smile sharpened. We show this town exactly who they're dealing with. The morning sunlight filtered through the living room window, casting a warm glow across the floorboards. Ethan stood by the window, his hands resting on his hips as he stared at the street outside. The town was waking up. Neighbors walking their dogs. Kids biking down the sidewalk. Parents loading their kids into cars for school. But beneath the quiet surface, Ethan could feel the tension simmering. Tiana's suspension hadn't gone unnoticed. He'd heard the whispers. Seen the judgmental glances. Of course she lashed out. What do you expect? That family was always going to be trouble. He shouldn't have adopted them. Ethan's jaw tightened. He had lived in this town for years. Served it. Protected it. But the moment his girls were seen as a problem, the town's loyalty had evaporated like smoke. They don't get to decide who belongs in this family, Ethan muttered under his breath. Behind him, footsteps padded into the room. He turned to see Amaya standing near the staircase, her arms crossed over her chest. You sure about this? She asked. Yeah, Ethan said. We can't let them win. And how are we going to fight this? Amaya's gaze sharpened. The school board isn't going to listen to you. They've already made up their minds. Then we make them listen. Ethan's eyes flashed with determination. We force them to see the truth. Amaya's lips curled slightly. And how do we do that? We get the community involved. Amaya's eyebrows shot up. And how exactly are you going to convince a town full of judgmental bigots to take our side? Not everyone's against us, Ethan said. There are good people here, people who know what's right. We just have to give them a reason to stand with us. And if they don't? Ethan smiled grimly. Then we fight harder. Later that day, Ethan and Amaya stood in front of the school board office, their backs straight and their expressions hard. A small crowd had gathered, parents, teachers, and even a few students who had heard about Tiana's suspension. Tiana stood nearby, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. Her face was tense, guarded. Sierra stood beside her, quiet but focused. "What if they don't listen?" Sierra asked. "They will," Ethan said. "Because we're not backing down." "Yet," Tiana said. "And what if they laugh us out of the room?" "Then we come back tomorrow," Ethan said simply. "And the next day. And the next." Tiana's gaze softened. "You're serious about this," she said. "Damn right I am." Just then, a familiar figure appeared at the edge of the crowd. Mother Henrietta. Dressed in her usual crisp church attire, her gray hair swept into a tight bun, she moved through the crowd with calm authority. Her sharp eyes met Ethan's. "Well," she said. "What's the plan?" Ethan smiled faintly. "Glad you could make it, Mother Henrietta." "I been waiting for you to fight back, Ethan," she said. "Took you long enough. Better late than never." Mother Henrietta's eyes softened as she glanced at Tiana. "You've got a strong girl there." "I know." The crowd began to grow larger. More people arriving. Some familiar faces. Some strangers. Even a few of Ethan's fellow officers showed up, standing toward the back, arms crossed. Amaya stepped closer to Ethan. "Okay. They're here. Now what?" "Now," Ethan said, "we make them listen." Inside the school board office, the tension was thick enough to cut with a knife. The board members sat behind a long table, their faces a mixture of boredom and thinly veiled disdain. Mrs. Carter sat at the center, her mouth drawn into a tight line. Ethan stood in front of them, flanked by Amaya and Mother Henrietta. Tiana sat in the audience, her arms crossed. "Mr. Carter," Mrs. Carter began stiffly, "you requested this meeting to challenge your daughter's suspension. We've already reviewed the case. The decision stands." "Then you didn't review it hard enough," Ethan said, his voice calm but sharp. Mrs. Carter's eyes narrowed. "Excuse me. You're punishing my daughter for defending herself," Ethan said. "But the boy who insulted her? He gets a warning." Mrs. Carter's lips thinned. "Mr. Carter." "No," Ethan cut in. "You listen to me. My daughter was called names. Racial slurs. And when she stood up for herself, you punished her. That's not justice. That's cowardice." A murmur rippled through the room. Mrs. Carter's gaze sharpened. "We have a zero-tolerance policy for violence." "Then enforce a zero-tolerance policy for racism," Ethan shot back. "That's not how this works." "Then change the system." Mrs. Carter's face darkened. "Look around," Ethan said, gesturing to the crowd behind him. "Do you see how many people showed up today? These are the people you represent. And they are watching you right now. They're watching to see if you have the courage to do what's right or if you're going to keep pretending this town doesn't have a problem." Mrs. Carter's jaw tightened. "Tiana stood up for herself," Ethan said, his voice rising. "She fought back because no one else did. And now you're punishing her for it?" The board members exchanged nervous glances. "This isn't just about my daughter," Ethan continued. "This is about how this town treats people who don't look like everyone else. And you know what? We're done being quiet about it." Silence. Mrs. Carter's expression flickered the first crack in her carefully composed mask. Ethan's gaze darkened. "So what's it going to be?" Mrs. Carter inhaled sharply. "We'll review the case." "No," Ethan said coldly. "You'll overturn the suspension." Today. Mrs. Carter's hands curled into fists. You're putting us in a difficult position, Mr. Carter. Good, Ethan said. A long silence stretched across the room. Finally, Mrs. Carter's gaze dropped. The suspension is overturned, she said reluctantly. A wave of relief swept through the room. Tiana's eyes widened. Thank you, Ethan said. Mrs. Carter stood. Don't thank me. I'm not, Ethan said. As they walked out of the office, Mother Henrietta smiled knowingly. That was impressive, she said. Ethan exhaled slowly. We're not done yet. No, Mother Henrietta agreed. But it's a start. Ethan glanced at Tiana, who was walking ahead of them, her head held higher than it had been in weeks. Yeah, Ethan said softly. It's a start. Ethan sat at the kitchen table, his hands wrapped around a cup of coffee that had long gone cold. Outside the window, the sun was beginning to set, streaking the sky with soft hues of orange and pink. His house was unusually quiet, the calm after the storm. It had been 2 days since the school board overturned Tiana's suspension. 2 days since Ethan had stood before that room of judgmental faces and forced them to face their own hypocrisy. 2 days since Tiana had smiled at him, really smiled for the first time in weeks. But Ethan knew that winning one battle wasn't the same as winning the war. One suspension overturned doesn't mean this town has changed. He rubbed the back of his neck, tension coiling in his shoulders. His thoughts were interrupted by the sound of footsteps. Amaya appeared at the doorway, a folder in her hands. She leaned against the door frame, her expression unreadable. Dad, she said. We need to talk. Ethan sighed and gestured toward the chair across from him. What's on your mind? Amaya sat down, sliding the folder across the table toward him. I've been thinking about what you said about how we have to make this town listen. About how we need to change the way things work. Ethan opened the folder. Inside were printed reports, newspaper articles, statistics, a carefully compiled record of racial discrimination cases from their town over the last decade. Suspensions, unfair punishments, racial bias in hiring, even reports of police profiling. You did all this? Ethan asked, his brow furrowing. Amaya nodded. It wasn't that hard to find once I started digging. This isn't just about Tiana. It's about how this town treats anyone who doesn't fit the mold. Ethan's eyes darkened as he flipped through the pages. This is bad. I know. What are you suggesting? Amaya leaned forward, her gaze sharp. We can't just fight each battle individually. That's what they expect us to do, react, get angry, let it fade. We need to go bigger. Ethan raised an eyebrow. Bigger. We start a foundation, Amaya said. A real one. A place where kids like Tiana and adults can go for support. Somewhere they can feel safe, where they can learn how to defend themselves, know their rights, and get legal protection when they need it. Ethan's eyes widened slightly. That's ambitious. It's necessary, Amaya said. If we want to change the way this town works, we have to give people the tools to fight back. Ethan sat back in his chair, considering. He glanced at the folder again, at the statistics, the cold hard evidence of what had been happening under the surface of their nice little town for years. He thought about Tiana. About how close she had come to giving up. It's going to take a lot of work, he said finally. I know, Amaya replied. But we have the connections. You know the police force, I know the schools, and Mother Henrietta has more influence in this town than anyone gives her credit for. Ethan's mouth quirked into a faint smile. That's true. I've already spoken to her, Amaya said. She's in. Ethan's eyes widened. Really? Really, Amaya said. She said, and I quote, about damn time. Ethan chuckled. That sounds like her. Amaya's gaze sharpened. But we need you too, Dad. People listen to you. They respect you even if some of them don't deserve you. Ethan's smile faded slightly. This could put a target on us, he said quietly. You understand that, right? Let them come, Amaya said, her eyes flashing with determination. We've already survived worse. Ethan sat in silence for a long moment, the weight of the decision pressing down on him. He thought about Tiana's tearful eyes in the car that day. The way the school board had looked at her like she was a problem instead of a person. All right, he said finally. Let's do it. A week later. The community center was packed. Rows of folding chairs filled the main hall. On the walls were posters of black leaders and activists: Martin Luther King Jr., Malcolm X, Angela Davis. Ethan stood at the front of the room, adjusting the microphone as the crowd settled. Amaya stood beside him, calm and focused. Tiana, Sierra, and the other girls sat in the front row, their eyes shining with curiosity and quiet excitement. Good evening, Ethan began, his voice carrying through the hall. I want to thank all of you for being here tonight. He paused, letting his gaze sweep over the crowd. He saw familiar faces: Mother Henrietta, Officer Brown from the department, even Mrs. Thompson sitting stiffly toward the back. You all know why we're here, Ethan said. Our town has a problem. A problem that's been ignored for too long. A problem of racism, discrimination, and injustice. The room was dead silent. We've seen it in our schools, Ethan continued. We've seen it in our police force. We've seen it in our neighborhoods. And for too long, we've let it slide. Amaya stepped forward. That changes today. Ethan's gaze sharpened. We're starting the Carter Foundation. A ripple of whispers ran through the room. The goal of this foundation is simple, Ethan said. To protect the vulnerable. To provide support and education. To make sure that what happened to Tiana, what's been happening to kids in this town for years, never happens again. Amaya's eyes flashed. We'll provide legal aid, educational resources, and a place for kids to come when they need help. We'll teach them how to defend themselves, not with violence, but with knowledge. With strength. With unity. Ethan's gaze darkened. And if this town wants to keep pretending that nothing's wrong, if they want to keep turning their backs on the people they don't want to see, we're going to make sure they can't ignore us anymore. This is about power, Amaya said. About reclaiming it. It's about family, Ethan added, his voice deep with emotion. Because that's what this is. Family isn't about blood. It's about showing up for each other. It's about standing together when things get hard. It's about love. He glanced toward Tiana, whose eyes were shining with unshed tears. This town tried to break my daughter, Ethan said. It failed. And now we're going to make sure that no one else has to fight that battle alone. The room erupted into applause. Mother Henrietta stood first, clapping steadily. Then Officer Brown. Then Mrs. Thompson. Within seconds, the entire room was on its feet. Amaya's hand brushed Ethan's arm. We did it. We're just getting started, Ethan said, his voice low. Tiana rose from her seat and crossed the room toward Ethan. Without a word, she hugged him fierce and tight. Thank you, she whispered. For what? Ethan asked softly. For fighting for me. Ethan's hand settled on the back of her head. Always. Tiana pulled back, her eyes shining. What now? She asked. Ethan's gaze hardened. Now, he said. We get to work. Ethan adjusted his tie in the bathroom mirror, his reflection staring back at him with a hardened expression. The early morning sun cast thin lines of light across his face. His jaw was tight, the weight of the day already pressing down on him. Today wasn't just any day. Today was the first official meeting of the Carter Foundation. And the town was watching. A knock on the bathroom door made him turn. Dad. Amaya's voice. Come in, Ethan said, his voice low. Amaya pushed the door open and leaned against the frame, arms crossed over her chest. She wore a sharp black blazer over a white blouse, her hair pulled into a neat bun. Professional and confident, a woman who knew exactly what she wanted. You ready? She asked. Ethan exhaled through his nose. Not really. Amaya's lips twitched. Good. That means you're taking it seriously. Ethan chuckled despite himself. You're starting to sound like Mother Henrietta. Amaya's gaze softened. She's waiting for us downstairs, by the way. With Tiana and Sierra. Ethan adjusted his tie again, feeling Amaya's eyes on him. You sure about this? Ethan asked. We could still pull back, keep this quiet, let it settle. Amaya's gaze sharpened. No. Ethan met her eyes in the mirror. We've already made noise, Amaya said. Now we have to keep the momentum going. Ethan sighed. I just don't want this to backfire. It won't, Amaya said. Because we're not alone anymore. Ethan turned toward her. Dad, Amaya said, her voice steady. It's not just us anymore. People are showing up. They're listening. They're ready to fight too. We started something bigger than ourselves. Ethan studied her face for a long moment before nodding slowly. Let's go then. Later that morning. The community center was packed. Rows of chairs lined the room, filled with people from every corner of town. Black, white, Latino, Asian faces, young and old, all gathered together under one roof. Ethan stood at the front of the room, Amaya at his side. Tiana and Sierra sat in the front row, while Mother Henrietta sat a few seats behind them, her expression calm but watchful. The town's police chief, Marcus Walker, stood near the back with several officers. Ethan could feel the weight of their attention. He took a steadying breath and stepped up to the microphone. Good morning, he said, his voice cutting through the low murmur of the crowd. The noise died down. Thank you all for coming today, Ethan continued. The fact that you're here tells me one thing: you care. About this town. About its future. About doing what's right. A few heads nodded. We've all seen what's happening here, Ethan said. We've seen how easy it is to look the other way when someone is treated unfairly. When kids are punished for defending themselves. When people are overlooked because of the color of their skin. Marcus Walker's eyes narrowed slightly, but he said nothing. We can't ignore it anymore, Ethan said, his voice hardening. We've started the Carter Foundation to make sure that no kid, no family feels like they have to stand alone. Amaya stepped up beside him. We're providing legal support, she said. Educational resources. Training. And most importantly, a community. Ethan's gaze sharpened. But this isn't just about support, he said. It's about accountability. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. We're going to make sure that schools, businesses, and even the police department know that discrimination has consequences, Ethan continued. We will stand with anyone who needs us. We will fight for justice. And we won't stop until this town becomes the place it was always meant to be. A single clap echoed through the room. Mother Henrietta. She stood, her wrinkled hands pressed together as she nodded toward Ethan. Then more clapping. More people rising to their feet. Within seconds, the entire room was on its feet, the sound of applause thundering through the building. Ethan's chest tightened. For the first time in a long time, he felt hope. Amaya leaned toward him. Told you. Ethan smiled faintly. Let's see if they still feel this way when things get hard. 1 week later. This isn't going to work. Tiana's voice was sharp as she paced across the dining room, her arms crossed. Amaya sat at the table, laptop open. Sierra was nearby, leaning against the wall. Ethan stood in the doorway, watching his daughters with narrowed eyes. It's already working, Amaya said, not looking up from the screen. 2 students from the high school reached out today. And we've already scheduled a legal workshop for next week. That's not what I mean, Tiana said, turning toward them. You think people are just going to let us change things without a fight? They're going to push back, Ethan said. We know that. You don't get it, Tiana said, her voice rising. I hear what people are saying at school. They're saying you're stirring up trouble. They're saying you're trying to change how this town works. Good, Ethan said. Tiana's eyes flashed. Good. Yeah, Ethan said, his gaze hardening. Because that means they're scared. Tiana's mouth opened, but no words came out. This town needs to change, Ethan said. And that means making people uncomfortable. And if they fight back? Tiana demanded. Then we fight harder, Amaya said. Tiana shook her head, her expression a mix of frustration and fear. It's not that simple. No, Ethan agreed. It's not. Tiana's hands curled into fists at her sides. You don't understand how this feels, she said quietly. To be the one people look at differently. To be the one who doesn't belong. Ethan's jaw tightened. You're right, he said. I don't. Tiana's eyes widened slightly. But I know what it feels like to see my daughter hurting and not know how to fix it, Ethan said, his voice low but fierce. I know what it feels like to want to protect you from a world that's too broken to understand you. Silence hung in the air between them. I can't change how people see you, Ethan said. But I can stand next to you while you face it. Tiana's face softened. We're not running away from this, Ethan said. Not anymore. Tiana's chest rose and fell rapidly as her anger and fear slowly drained away. Okay, she whispered. Ethan's gaze steadied. Okay. Tiana nodded. Okay. Amaya smiled faintly. We start with the school, Ethan said. Then the police department. Then the businesses. And if they push back? Tiana asked. Ethan's eyes darkened. Then we push harder. The next day, Ethan and Amaya stood in front of the school board again. Only this time, they weren't alone. Dozens of students and parents stood behind them. Tiana was there too, her arms crossed defiant. Ethan took a breath and faced the board members. Let's talk about accountability, he said. And this time, no one was leaving the room until they were heard. Ethan stood at the center of the school board meeting, the fluorescent lights overhead casting a harsh glow on the wooden paneled walls. The room was packed: students, parents, teachers, and tension hung so thick in the air that Ethan could feel it pressing against his chest. Amaya stood beside him, a folder tucked under her arm. Tiana sat in the front row, her arms crossed and her jaw set in a hard line. Sierra was next to her, clutching a pen so tightly her knuckles were white. At the front of the room sat the school board: 5 middle-aged men and 1 woman, each wearing the same detached, bureaucratic expression Ethan had come to hate. The chairman, Mr. Raymond Whitaker, adjusted his glasses and cleared his throat. "Mr. Carter," Whitaker said, his tone clipped. "I assume you have prepared remarks." Ethan stepped toward the microphone. His pulse thrummed in his ears, but his voice remained steady. "Yes, I do." He unfolded a piece of paper, glanced at it once, then set it aside. He didn't need notes for this. "We're here because the school has a problem," Ethan began, his eyes sweeping across the room. "A problem that's been ignored for too long." A low murmur rippled through the crowd. "Last month, my daughter Tiana was suspended for defending herself after a student called her a racial slur," Ethan continued. "The student who provoked the situation faced no consequences. My daughter was punished for standing up for herself." Whitaker sighed, adjusting his glasses. "Mr. Carter, as we explained at the time." "Save it," Amaya interrupted, her tone sharp. "You're not going to talk your way out of this." Whitaker's eyes narrowed. "Ms. Carter, this meeting is not the appropriate place for emotional outbursts." "No," Ethan said, his voice rising. "This is exactly the place for it." The crowd stirred. "This isn't about one suspension," Ethan said. "This is about a pattern of discrimination. Students of color are punished more harshly for the same infractions. They're disciplined more often. They're targeted. And it's not just students." Amaya handed him a folder. "These are records," Ethan said, holding up the folder. 10 years of disciplinary reports. 10 years of racial disparity in how students are treated. 10 years of evidence that the school is failing its students of color." Whitaker's face darkened. "I don't see how this—" "Of course you don't," Ethan cut in. "Because you've never had to worry about whether your child would be singled out for the color of their skin." Whitaker's mouth opened, but Ethan wasn't finished. "When Tiana was suspended, I asked myself how it happened," Ethan said. "How a school board full of educated adults could let this happen." He let the silence hang for a moment before answering his own question. "Because you're not listening," Ethan said, his voice sharp. "You've built a system that works for you and people like you but leaves everyone else to fend for themselves." Whitaker's face flushed. "You have no evidence that the school board—" "You want evidence?" Amaya cut in, her eyes flashing. She opened the folder and handed copies of the disciplinary reports to the other board members. "The data is all there," Amaya said. "Same infractions, different punishments. Suspensions, expulsions, the pattern is undeniable." "This is outrageous," one of the board members muttered. "No," Ethan said. "What's outrageous is that it took this long for someone to call you out on it." Whitaker stood, his expression dark. "What exactly do you expect us to do, Mr. Carter?" "Start by changing the rules," Ethan said. "You create the guidelines for punishment. You enforce them. That means you can change them." "And if we refuse?" Whitaker asked, his voice dripping with condescension. Amaya stepped forward. "Then we'll take this public." Whitaker's jaw tightened. "The Carter Foundation already has the attention of the State Board of Education," Amaya said. We've sent them copies of the reports. We've contacted the media. If you refuse to take action, we'll make sure the whole town knows what you're trying to hide. Whitaker's face paled. We're not asking, Ethan said, his voice cold. We're telling you what's going to happen. Whitaker's mouth twisted in anger, but Ethan could see the calculation in his eyes. Fine, Whitaker said, his voice sharp. We'll form a committee. Not good enough, Ethan said. We want permanent policy changes. Bias training for teachers and staff. A transparent disciplinary process with oversight from the community. That's excessive, another board member said. No, Amaya said, her eyes hard. That's justice. Whitaker's lips pressed into a thin line. You have 30 days to present a new plan to the community, Ethan said. If you don't, we'll take it to the state. Whitaker's hands curled into fists at his sides. You're setting a dangerous precedent, Mr. Carter. Ethan's gaze didn't waver. Good. Whitaker sat down, his face tight with anger. This meeting is adjourned. Ethan stepped back from the microphone as the room erupted into whispers. Amaya grinned. Not bad. We'll see if they follow through, Ethan muttered. As Ethan and Amaya left the room, Tiana caught his arm. Dad, she said, her eyes shining. You really think this will work? Ethan brushed his hand over her shoulder. I think we just cracked the system, he said. Now we see how hard it tries to put itself back together. 2 weeks later. The first step came faster than expected. The school board released a public statement admitting to inconsistencies in their disciplinary process and committing to a full review. They agreed to introduce bias training and appoint a community oversight committee with Amaya as one of the co-chairs. It was progress. But it wasn't over. You know they're going to resist us at every step, Amaya said, sitting across from Ethan at the dining room table. I know, Ethan replied. And you're ready for that. Ethan's gaze hardened. Let them try. 1 month later. Ethan sat at the back of the auditorium as the new disciplinary guidelines were announced. Students and parents filed out afterward, many of them thanking Amaya as they passed. Tiana sat next to Ethan, her arms crossed but her eyes shining. I still don't think this town will ever really change, Tiana said. Ethan smiled faintly. Maybe not all at once, he said. But we made them listen. That's a start. Tiana leaned against him, her head resting on his shoulder. Thanks for fighting for me, Dad, she whispered. Ethan kissed the top of her head. Always. Across the room, Amaya stood with Mother Henrietta and Marcus Walker, reviewing the committee's first report. Ethan's eyes narrowed slightly. What are you thinking? Tiana asked. Ethan's gaze darkened. We fixed the schools, he said. Now we go after the police. Tiana's head shot up. You really think they'll let us? Ethan's smile was dangerous. Let them try to stop us. Ethan stood at the edge of the parking lot, his hands resting on his hips as the late afternoon sun blazed overhead. Across from him, the town's police station loomed, a squat, gray concrete building with narrow windows and a battered American flag hanging over the entrance. The Carter Foundation had already forced the school board to change its policies. Now, it was time for the harder fight. The police department. This wasn't going to be like the school board meeting. The police force didn't answer to public pressure the same way. They had power, real power, and Ethan knew exactly how dangerous that made them. You ready? Amaya's voice cut through the heat, steady and sharp. She stood at his side, a stack of folders tucked under one arm, her hair pulled back into a low braid. She was wearing a crisp white blouse and a navy skirt, businesslike, professional, but her eyes were cold steel. Not really, Ethan admitted. Amaya smiled faintly. Good. That means you're thinking clearly. The doors to the station opened. Chief Marcus Walker stepped out, his face as hard as the pavement beneath their feet. His uniform was crisp, his badge polished. He stopped in front of them, arms crossed over his broad chest. I assume this isn't a social call, Walker said, his tone dry. No, Ethan said. We need to talk. Walker's gaze darkened. Follow me. Inside the station. The station smelled like old coffee and stale air conditioning. Officers moved briskly through the halls, most of them shooting quick, guarded glances at Ethan and Amaya as they passed. Walker led them to a small conference room. The walls were bare except for a row of faded photos of former police chiefs. Walker sat at the head of the table. Ethan and Amaya sat opposite him. All right, Walker said, his eyes narrowing. Let's hear it. Ethan leaned forward. We've received over 24 complaints of racial profiling from the department over the past year. Walker's brow lifted slightly. We've also collected reports from Black and Latino drivers pulled over without cause. Searches conducted without warrants. Excessive force during routine stops, Amaya added. Not to mention the 5 incidents involving students from the high school, Ethan said. After the disciplinary changes, kids are still telling us they feel targeted. Walker's expression didn't change. I see, he said. And you've compiled evidence. Amaya set the folder down on the table. It's all here. Dates, names, badge numbers. Walker opened the folder. His eyes skimmed the pages. Slowly, his jaw tightened. I'm going to assume this was obtained, legally. Public records, Amaya said coolly. And first-hand testimony. Walker's eyes lifted to Ethan. And you want me to, what, exactly? Fix it, Ethan said. We want the department to revise its use of force policies. We want body cam footage released in any case of disputed arrest. We want independent oversight for complaints against officers. Walker's mouth twisted. That's ambitious, he said. And unrealistic. We got the school board to change, Ethan said. We can do the same here. The school board doesn't carry weapons, Walker replied. Ethan's eyes narrowed. Are you threatening us? Walker smiled faintly. Of course not. Just pointing out the difference between political pressure and reality. Amaya's gaze sharpened. Chief Walker, if you refuse to cooperate, we'll escalate this. Walker's smile faded. To whom? State investigators, Ethan said. Federal authorities. Walker leaned back in his chair, his arms still crossed. You'd be opening a wound this town might not recover from, Walker said. The press would get involved. The town's reputation would suffer. Funding would be cut. Or, Amaya said, you could fix the problem before it gets that far. Walker's eyes locked on hers. You're playing a dangerous game, he said. We're not playing, Ethan replied. The silence stretched between them. Walker stood. Give me a week, Walker said. I'll review the files. We'll expect a response, Ethan said. You'll get one, Walker replied. His eyes darkened. Whether you like it or not. 3 days later. Ethan was sitting on the back porch when Amaya's phone buzzed. It's Walker, she said, holding up the screen. Ethan straightened. Put it on speaker. Amaya tapped the screen. Mr. Carter, Walker's voice crackled over the line. I've reviewed the files. There are inconsistencies. Inconsistencies. Ethan repeated. Enough that I'm willing to recommend some policy adjustments, Walker said. Ethan's eyes narrowed. But, Walker continued, I have conditions. Of course you do, Amaya said. We'll review the complaints internally, Walker said. But body cam footage remains off the table. We can't risk compromising ongoing investigations. Not good enough, Ethan said. It's a compromise, Walker replied. No, Amaya said. It's a way to hide accountability. Walker's voice hardened. I'm giving you a path to progress. Take it or leave it. Ethan stood and took the phone from Amaya. We'll think about it, he said. But you should know something, Chief Walker. What's that? We're not going away, Ethan said. If you don't follow through, we'll take this higher. Do what you need to do, Walker said. The call ended. Amaya sighed. He's not going to change unless we make him. I know, Ethan said. So what's the next step? Amaya asked. Ethan's jaw tightened. We make them uncomfortable. 2 weeks later. A protest. A real one. Organized by Amaya and Tiana, the protest stretched down Main Street. Hundreds of people carried signs. Justice for all. End racial profiling. Protect our kids. Ethan stood at the front with Amaya, Tiana, and Sierra. His daughter's eyes were burning with determination. Police officers lined the sidewalks. Some watched silently. Others whispered into radios. Walker stood at the edge of the line, his expression blank. Tiana stepped toward him. How does it feel? She asked, her voice sharp. Being the one under the microscope. Walker's jaw flexed. This isn't going away, Ethan said, stepping beside Tiana. We're going to keep showing up. Every day. Every time something happens. You think you can outlast us? Walker asked. Ethan smiled coldly. We're not going anywhere. 3 days later. Walker called. You win, he said, his voice strained. Body cam footage will be made available in cases of disputed arrest. Use of force policies will be revised. Independent oversight will be established. And complaints? Ethan asked. Reviewed publicly, Walker said. Good, Ethan said. Now we're getting somewhere. But be careful, Carter, Walker said, his voice low. There are people in this town who won't be happy about this. Let them come, Ethan replied. As Ethan hung up, Amaya smiled. What? Ethan asked. We just cracked the police department. Ethan's gaze darkened. Not yet, he said. We've opened the door. Now we have to walk through it. The knock on the door came just after midnight. Ethan sat up instantly, his senses sharp despite the late hour. Amaya stirred beside him, groaning as the sound echoed through the quiet house. Who the hell? Amaya muttered sleepily. Ethan was already pulling on his jeans. He grabbed a t-shirt from the chair and slid his feet into his boots. The knock came again, louder this time. Amaya sat up, rubbing her eyes. Ethan, be careful. Ethan's jaw tightened as he headed for the door. He pulled it open to find Marcus Walker standing on the front porch, his face partially illuminated by the flickering glow of the street lamp. Walker's expression was hard, his shoulders tense beneath his jacket. He wasn't in uniform. "Walker," Ethan said, his tone sharp. "We need to talk," Walker said. His voice was low and edged with something Ethan couldn't quite place: urgency and fear. "It's the middle of the night." "Yeah," Walker said, stepping forward. "Because this can't wait." Ethan stepped back reluctantly, allowing Walker to enter. Amaya appeared in the hallway, her arms crossed over her chest. "What's going on?" she asked. Walker glanced at her before locking eyes with Ethan. "You need to take this seriously," Walker said. "You've been making waves, Carter. And not just in this town." "What are you talking about?" Ethan demanded. Walker took a slow breath. "I got a call from someone higher up the chain," Walker said. "Someone with more power than me." "Who?" Amaya pressed. Walker's eyes darkened. "State Attorney's Office." Ethan's stomach tightened. "They're not happy about the protests. Or the policy changes." "Let them be unhappy," Ethan said coldly. "No," Walker said, shaking his head. "You don't understand. This isn't just about the department anymore. You put a spotlight on this town. There are people in power who don't want that. And what exactly are they planning to do about it?" Amaya asked. Walker hesitated. "They're looking for leverage," Walker said. "A way to silence you." "Leverage?" Ethan's jaw tightened. "What kind of leverage?" Walker rubbed the back of his neck. "They're digging into your past," Walker said. "And not just yours. They've already started looking into Amaya's records. Your financials. Any legal trouble. Even your kids." Amaya's breath caught. "Our kids? They're trying to find something, anything to discredit you," Walker said. "And if they can't find something?" Ethan's eyes darkened. "They'll manufacture it?" Walker nodded grimly. "That's why I'm here," Walker said. "I don't like you, Carter. But I respect you. And I'm not going to stand by and watch them tear you down." Ethan's fists curled at his sides. "Why are you telling me this?" Ethan asked. Walker's expression softened just a little. "Because I know what it's like to fight the system," Walker said. "And I know how it fights back." Amaya stepped forward. "What are we supposed to do?" Walker's gaze sharpened. "You hold the line," he said. "They want you to stop pushing. They want you to give up. Don't." Ethan's gaze hardened. "We won't." Walker gave him a single nod. "Good," Walker said. He turned toward the door, then hesitated. "But be ready, Carter. If they can't scare you into submission, they'll come for your family. The threat arrives." The first sign of trouble came 2 days later. Ethan was dropping Tiana off at basketball practice when he noticed the same black SUV parked across the street. It was unmarked, but the tinted windows and government plates told him everything he needed to know. "Dad," Tiana said, looking up at him from the passenger seat. Ethan's hands tightened around the steering wheel. "Stay inside the gym until I come to get you," Ethan said. "Why?" "Just do it," Ethan said. "Please." Tiana hesitated, her eyes searching his face, then nodded. As soon as she was inside, Ethan crossed the street and approached the SUV. The window lowered slowly. A man in a dark suit sat inside. His hair was slicked back, and he was wearing dark sunglasses even though it was overcast. "Mr. Carter," the man said smoothly. "Who are you?" Ethan demanded. "Just someone interested in how things are developing here," the man said. His voice was calm, too calm. "You've made quite a bit of noise." "And?" Ethan growled. The man smiled faintly. "We'd prefer if you quieted down," the man said. "Things tend to get messy when people push too hard." Ethan's blood ran cold. Was that a threat? "A suggestion," the man replied. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a thin white envelope. "Consider this a friendly warning." Ethan didn't take it. "We know where your family lives," the man said, his smile sharpening. "We know where your daughters go to school. We'd hate for something unfortunate to happen." Ethan's vision blurred with rage. He lunged toward the window. But the SUV peeled away before he could grab the man's collar. Ethan stood in the street, his chest heaving, the sound of his pulse roaring in his ears. "That night. We need to talk," Ethan said, closing the door behind him. Amaya looked up from the couch. Tiana, Sierra, and the younger girls were sitting around the coffee table, playing a board game. "Now?" Amaya asked. "Now," Ethan said, his voice sharp. Amaya followed him into the kitchen. "What's wrong?" Ethan's jaw tightened. "Someone followed me today," Ethan said. "They knew where I was. They knew about the kids." Amaya's face paled. "Who?" "Government," Ethan said. "Or someone working for them." Amaya's eyes narrowed. "They're trying to scare us." "It's working," Ethan admitted. "But I'm not backing down." Amaya's gaze sharpened. "Neither am I." "We need protection," Ethan said. "And we need it fast." Amaya's jaw tightened. "We call Marcus." Ethan hesitated. "You think we can trust him?" "He warned us," Amaya said. "That counts for something." Ethan's eyes darkened. "Then let's make the call." The response. 2 hours later, Walker arrived at their house. "I already put the request in," Walker said. "Patrol cars will pass by your house every hour. We'll make sure there's always someone watching the girls." "And if they try again?" Ethan asked. Walker's expression turned to steel. "Then we make them regret it." Late that night, Ethan lay awake, his arm around Amaya, his mind racing. They were in the fire now. But he wasn't going to run. And if they came for his family, if they even tried, Ethan Carter would burn the whole system down. Ethan stood on the steps of the town hall, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows across the crowd gathered below him. Hundreds of people stood shoulder to shoulder, faces tight with anticipation. Reporters lined the edges of the crowd, cameras aimed toward the stage. The tension in the air was palpable, like a live wire ready to snap. Amaya stood at his side, her hand resting lightly on his arm. Tiana, Sierra, and the rest of the girls stood in a line behind him. Strong. United. Ready. Across the street, a line of police officers stood at attention, including Marcus Walker. The chief's face was hard, his expression unreadable. Flanking him were several suited men with dark glasses and earpieces. Government agents. Watching. Waiting. "They're here," Amaya whispered. "Good," Ethan said. His jaw tightened. "Let them watch." He stepped forward toward the podium, his hands gripping the sides as he took a steady breath. His gaze swept over the crowd, faces young and old, white and black, standing side by side. They weren't just here for him. They were here for something bigger.